I never thought buying a lakefront property in Hayden, Idaho would turn into a legal war with the most vindictive woman I'd ever meet. But here I was, staring at a chain-link fence blocking my only access to the water. My name is Franklin Xavier, and I'd spent 30 years working as a civil engineer in Seattle before deciding to retire somewhere peaceful. The property I bought was perfect 3 acres of wooded land with 200 feet of lake frontage on Lake Coeur d'Alene. The listing specifically mentioned water access via a private boat ramp shared with the neighboring Pine Vista Estates development. What they failed to mention was that the Homeowners Association for Pine Vista was run by a woman named Margaret Pemberton, who apparently considered herself the gatekeeper of all things lake-related. The trouble started 3 weeks after I moved in. I'd just finished unpacking when I decided to take my 17-foot fishing boat out for the first time. The boat ramp was a simple concrete slope that ran from the community road down into the water, maintained by the Pine Vista HOA, but technically situated on a shared easement that included my property line. At least, that's what my title insurance showed. As I was backing my truck down the ramp, a silver Mercedes SUV came screeching up behind me, horn blaring like I was committing a felony. Out stepped Margaret, mid-50s, blonde hair cut in that aggressive bob that screamed, "I want to speak to the manager," and wearing a white pantsuit that probably cost more than my boat. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" she shouted, her voice pitched high enough to scare off the geese floating nearby. I put my truck in park and stepped out, launching my boat. "And you are?" "I'm Margaret Pemberton, president of the Pine Vista HOA board. This ramp is for Pine Vista residents only." I kept my voice calm. "Madam, I own the property right there." I pointed to my land. "My deed shows an easement for water access through this ramp." Her face flushed red. "That easement was terminated when the previous owner sold. You have no rights here." Now, I'd reviewed every single document before closing. "I'm going to have to disagree with you there. My title company confirmed the easement is valid and permanent." "We'll see about that," she snapped. "I'm calling the sheriff." "Go ahead," I said, and went back to launching my boat. She did call the sheriff. Deputy Morrison arrived 20 minutes later while I was out on the water. By the time I got back, he'd apparently reviewed the situation and left a note on my truck windshield telling me to contact the county records office if there was a dispute about property rights. Margaret's Mercedes was gone, but I had a feeling this wasn't over. I was right. 2 days later, I found a certified letter in my mailbox. The Pine Vista HOA was officially notifying me that they were disputing my easement claim and that I was prohibited from using the boat ramp pending legal resolution. They also mentioned that if I attempted to use it again, they would seek an immediate injunction. I called my real estate attorney, David Chen, who'd handled my property purchase. He reviewed the letter and laughed. "Franklin, they don't have a leg to stand on. Your easement is clearly documented and runs with the land. It was established in 1987 when the original parcel was subdivided. They can't just terminate it unilaterally. So what do? Use your boat ramp. If they want to sue, let them. They'll lose." I trusted David's judgment, so the following Saturday morning, I hitched up my boat and headed down to the ramp again. This time, I found something new. A chain-link fence had been installed overnight, completely blocking access to the ramp. A large sign read, "Private property, Pine Vista. Residents only. Trespassers will be prosecuted." I stood there for a long moment, feeling my blood pressure rise. This was beyond petty. They'd physically blocked legal access to my property rights. I took photos from every angle, then called David. "They fenced it?" He sounded genuinely surprised. "That's bold and stupid. Franklin, they just committed what's called self-help eviction, which is illegal in Idaho. You could sue them for damages right now." "I want to use my boat ramp," I said flatly. "What are my options?" "Well, you could cut the fence down. You'd be legally justified. Or we can file an emergency motion to compel access. That would take maybe a week." I thought about it. "Let's do this the right way. File the motion." David filed the paperwork that Monday. The hearing was scheduled for the following Friday. In the meantime, I did some research of my own. I pulled up the property records for the entire area and made an interesting discovery. The main road that serviced all 37 homes in Pine Vista Estates crossed through a corner of my property. The road easement had been granted by the previous owner of my land back in 1989, giving the HOA the right to maintain and use the road for access to their development. But unlike my water access easement, which was permanent and irrevocable, this road easement had a specific clause I found buried in the language. It could be terminated by either party with 180 days written notice if the other party was found to be in material breach of good faith and neighborly conduct. I smiled when I read that. It was vague, probably not enforceable, but it was there, and it gave me an idea. The hearing arrived. Margaret showed up with 2 other HOA board members and their attorney, a slick-looking guy named Preston Ward who wore cufflinks shaped like golf clubs. David and I sat on the opposite side of the courtroom. Judge Richardson reviewed the case quickly. Preston argued that the easement had been functionally abandoned because the previous owner hadn't used it in 3 years. David countered with the actual legal standard easements don't terminate through non-use in Idaho unless there's explicit abandonment with intent, which there wasn't. The judge barely took 15 minutes to rule. The easement is clearly valid and binding. The fence constitutes illegal interference with Mr. Xavier's property rights. The HOA is ordered to remove it immediately and restore full access. Mr. Xavier is also awarded attorney's fees and costs. Margaret's face went purple. As we left the courtroom, she hissed at me. "This isn't over." "I sure hope not," I replied cheerfully. The fence came down that afternoon, workers sent by the HOA removing it while Margaret supervised, glaring at my house the entire time. I waved at her from my porch. For a week, things were quiet. I used the boat ramp 3 times without incident. Then, on Thursday evening, I returned from a fishing trip to find a notice posted on the gate of my property. The HOA was implementing safety improvements to the boat ramp area, which would require closing it for approximately 6 weeks starting Monday. I called David immediately. "Can they do this?" "Let me see the notice." I emailed him a photo. He called back 10 minutes later. "It's questionable. They're allowed to maintain the ramp, but 6 weeks is excessive and the timing is suspicious. We could fight it, but honestly, Franklin, it might not be worth it. You'd spend more in legal fees than the 6 weeks of inconvenience is worth." I sat on my porch that night, looking out at the lake, thinking, Margaret was going to make my life miserable. Every time I won, she'd find another way to interfere. The woman had nothing better to do than torment me, apparently. That's when I remembered the road easement. I spent the weekend reviewing every document, every survey, every deed record. My property was shaped like an irregular polygon, with most of it running parallel to the lake, but one narrow strip extending east toward the main highway. Pine Vista Estates was built on a separate parcel to the north, accessible only by Pine Vista Drive, which curved through that eastern strip of my land before connecting to Highway 95. The easement was right there in black and white, granted in 1989, with that termination clause about material breach of good faith and neighborly conduct. Monday morning, I drafted a formal letter. I cited the repeated harassment, the illegal fence, the retaliatory closure of the boat ramp, and Margaret's explicit statement that she intended to continue making my life difficult. I declared these actions a material breach of good faith and neighborly conduct, and provided the required 180 days notice of easement termination. After November 15th, Pine Vista Drive would no longer have permission to cross my property. I sent copies to the HOA board, to Margaret personally, to the county, and to every homeowner in Pine Vista Estates via certified mail. That cost me about $400 in postage alone, but it was worth it. The response was instantaneous and explosive. My phone started ringing within hours, angry Pine Vista residents demanding to know if I was serious. I calmly explained that, yes, I was completely serious, and that if they had concerns, they should direct them to their HOA president, who'd made my life miserable despite my legal rights. Margaret called me herself that evening, her voice shaking with rage. "You can't do this. That road is the only access to 37 homes." "Actually, I can," I said pleasantly. "The easement has a termination clause. I've invoked it. You have 180 days to find alternative access or to convince me that the HOA will stop interfering with my property rights." "This is extortion." "No, this is consequences. You want to play property rights games? Let's play." She hung up on me. 2 days later, I received a letter from Preston Ward threatening legal action. David sent back a response explaining that the termination clause was valid and that his client was acting within his rights. If the HOA wished to negotiate, Mr. Xavier was willing to discuss terms. The next HOA board meeting was apparently a war zone. One of my neighbors, a friendly guy named Tom who lived just outside Pine Vista Estates, told me he'd heard from friends who attended that the residents were furious with Margaret. Several people demanded she negotiate with me. She'd reportedly shouted that she would never negotiate with someone who was trying to blackmail the community. Meanwhile, the boat ramp maintenance began. And by maintenance, I mean they completely tore up the concrete. Workers arrived with jackhammers and demolished the entire ramp down to bare dirt, then stopped working. The area was left as a muddy, unusable mess. I took photos and sent them to David. This is retaliatory destruction of the easement property. We can sue for this. Do we want to? I asked. Or do we want to solve the actual problem? What are you thinking? I'm thinking I build my own boat ramp. My property had 200 feet of lake frontage. The shared ramp was on the northern edge, right against the property line with Pine Vista. But I had plenty of shoreline on the southern side of my lot, completely separate from the HOA property. The slope was steeper there, which was why the original ramp hadn't been built on that side, but with modern engineering, it was entirely feasible. I spent a week designing the ramp. The tricky part was that I'd need to build a new access road from my house down to the southern section of shoreline, which would require some grading and probably a small retaining wall. I'd also need permits from the county and from the Idaho Department of Lands, which managed lake access. The permitting process took 3 weeks. I submitted detailed engineering plans, environmental impact assessments, and proof that my property could support the construction. The county was actually quite helpful, apparently. They'd dealt with Margaret and the Pine Vista HOA before and weren't fans. While I waited for permits, the 180-day clock kept ticking. It was now mid-June. The road easement would terminate on November 15th. Margaret had gone completely silent, which worried me more than her yelling had. She was planning something. My permits were approved in early July. I hired a local contractor named Rick Johansson who specialized in lakefront construction. Rick was a big bearded guy who drove a Ford F350 with a diesel engine that could probably pull a house off its foundation. He took one look at my plans and grinned. "Margaret Pemberton piss you off, huh?" "How'd you know?" "She's got a reputation. I worked on a deck for one of the Pine Vista residents last year. She tried to fine them for the color of the wood stain. Said it violated community aesthetics." He shook his head. "I'd be happy to help you build this ramp." Construction started July 10th. Rick brought in an excavator and started carving a road down the slope of my property toward the southern shoreline. The noise was considerable diesel engines, backup beepers, the crash of trees being cleared. Margaret's house was about 300 yards away, just far enough that she couldn't complain about noise ordinances, but close enough that she definitely knew what was happening. She came over on day 2. I was supervising the excavator work when her Mercedes pulled up, driving right onto my property without permission. I walked over to her car and waited for her to roll down the window. "You can't build this," she said without preamble. "I absolutely can. I have all the permits. Would you like to see them?" "This is just to spite the HOA. This is to access the lake, which is my legal right. The fact that it's necessary because your HOA destroyed the shared ramp is just unfortunate. We're repairing the ramp." "Really? Because it's been sitting as a mud pit for 3 weeks now. You know what? I don't care anymore. I'll use my own ramp." Her eyes narrowed. "You think you can cut off our road access?" "I know I can. The easement terminates November 15th unless we reach an agreement." "What do you want?" The words came out like she was chewing glass. "I want you to leave me alone. Restore the shared ramp to working condition, drop all opposition to my easement rights, and personally apologize for harassing me." Margaret stared at me like I'd asked her to cut off her own arm. "Never." She drove off, her tires spitting gravel. Rick walked over, wiping his forehead with a rag. "She seems nice." "She's delightful," I said dryly. The road construction took 2 weeks. Rick's crew graded a smooth path from my driveway down to the southern shore, installed a retaining wall to prevent erosion, and laid down a base of compacted gravel. While that was happening, a specialized marine construction crew arrived to build the actual boat ramp. This wasn't going to be some simple concrete slope. I designed it properly, a reinforced concrete ramp with a non-slip surface, built to handle regular use and ice heaving during Idaho winters. The crew sank pilings into the lake bed, poured a foundation, and constructed the ramp with a gentle slope perfect for launching boats. The whole project cost me $73,000. It was a hell of a lot of money, but I had it, and watching Margaret's face every time she drove past and saw the progress was almost worth the cost by itself. Meanwhile, the November 15th deadline was approaching. It was now late August. Pine Vista residents were getting nervous. I started receiving letters, some apologetic, some angry, some begging me to reconsider. A few people offered to pay me for the easement extension. One guy offered me $10,000. I responded to each letter the same way. I was willing to negotiate with the HOA as a whole, but only if Margaret Pemberton resigned as president and the board agreed to permanently stop interfering with my property rights. That didn't go over well with Margaret. She sent me a letter threatening to sue me for every cause of action she could think of: extortion, blackmail, intentional infliction of emotional distress. David sent back a response, shredding each claim and reminding her that she'd started this fight by illegally blocking my boat ramp access. My new boat ramp was completed on September 2nd. Rick's crew did the final grading, sealed the concrete, and installed proper lighting along the access road. I christened it by launching my boat and spending the entire afternoon on the lake, fishing and enjoying the late summer weather. When I got back, there was a crowd waiting at the end of my driveway. About 15 Pine Vista residents, including several I recognized from the neighborhood. A tall man in his 60s stepped forward. "Mr. Xavier, I'm Robert Hensley. I live on Cedar Court in Pine Vista." "What can I do for you, Mr. Hensley?" "We'd like to talk to you about the road easement situation. Is there somewhere we could speak?" I invited them to sit in my backyard, which had a large patio with enough seating. I brought out water and lemonade while they settled in. Robert spoke first. "Mr. Xavier, we want you to know that most of us don't support how Margaret has treated you. We've been trying to remove her from the HOA board for 2 years, but she's entrenched. She has allies, and she's made it very difficult." A woman I didn't know spoke up. She threatened to fine me $5,000 because my Christmas lights were up until January 3rd. She's vindictive and petty, and she's made living here miserable for anyone who disagrees with her. Others chimed in with their own stories. Margaret had fined people for grass being a half-inch too tall. She'd tried to ban a resident's therapy dog because it wasn't on the approved breed list. She'd blocked a mother from installing a wheelchair ramp for her disabled son because it wasn't aesthetically consistent with the neighborhood. I listened to all of it, my anger growing. This woman was a tyrant. "So what do you want from me?" I asked. Robert said, "We're calling an emergency meeting to vote Margaret out, but we need time. The HOA bylaws require 30 days notice for a removal vote, and we need to line up votes. We're asking you to extend the road easement deadline by 90 days. That will give us until mid-February to remove Margaret and elect a new board that will negotiate with you in good faith." I considered it. "What happens if you can't remove her?" "Then we'll deal with the road closure," Robert said firmly. "We'll build a new access road on HOA property, or we'll force a sale of Margaret's house to buy access through her lot. One way or another, we're done letting her run this community like her personal fiefdom." I respected that. "All right, I'll extend the deadline to February 15th, but I want regular updates on your progress." They agreed. I drafted an amendment to my termination notice and sent it out the next day. Margaret, predictably, lost her mind. She sent an email to all Pine Vista residents calling them traitors and claiming they were collaborating with the enemy. She accused Robert of being part of a conspiracy to destroy property values. She threatened to sue anyone who voted against her. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for October 8th, 30 days after the notice went out. I wasn't a member of the HOA, so I couldn't attend, but Tom kept me updated. He went as a guest of one of the residents. According to Tom, the meeting was absolute chaos. Margaret showed up with Preston Ward and tried to argue that the removal vote was invalid on technical grounds. Robert countered with a detailed presentation of Margaret's violations of her fiduciary duty as HOA president, including financial records showing she'd spent $15,000 of HOA funds on legal fees fighting me without board approval. That was news to most residents. The HOA budget was supposed to be transparent, but Margaret had apparently been hiding expenses in vague categories like community improvements and legal compliance. The vote wasn't even close. 31 homeowners voted to remove Margaret. Only 6 voted to keep her, including Margaret herself. She was out. The new board president was a woman named Linda Chen, no relation to my attorney David, who was a retired accountant with no patience for nonsense. Her first official act was to send me a letter requesting a meeting to negotiate. We met at a coffee shop in downtown Hayden. Linda brought Robert and another board member named James. I brought David, just to keep everything official. Mr. Xavier, Linda began, I want to start by apologizing. The way you've been treated is unacceptable. The HOA should never have blocked your boat ramp access, and Margaret's behavior was unconscionable. I appreciate that, I said. We'd like to find a solution that works for everyone. We need that road access. You need assurance that the HOA won't harass you anymore. How do we make this work? David and I had discussed this. Here's what I want. First, the HOA formally acknowledges my permanent easement for water access via the original shared boat ramp. Second, the HOA restores that ramp to full working condition within 30 days. Third, the HOA pays my attorney's fees for all the legal work related to defending my easement rights. That's about $12,000. Fourth, I want a formal written apology from the HOA board. And fifth, I want Margaret Pemberton personally banned from ever serving on the HOA board again, written into the bylaws. Linda didn't hesitate. Done. All of it. In exchange, you'll grant a permanent easement for Pine Vista Drive across your property? Yes. No termination clause this time. Permanent and irrevocable, as long as the HOA maintains the road and honors my water access rights. We shook hands. David and the HOA's new attorney drafted the agreements over the next week. The shared boat ramp was restored properly this time, with fresh concrete and proper drainage. The HOA cut me a check for $12,000, and I received a formal letter of apology signed by all 5 board members. The road easement was finalized on November 30th, with plenty of time to spare before the February deadline. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. Margaret wasn't going to let this go quietly. On December 3rd, I was backing my truck down my new personal boat ramp when I noticed something odd. The water level seemed low, and there was an unusual amount of debris floating near my dock. I got out to investigate and found dozens of tree branches, chunks of wood, and even some old tires clustered around my boat ramp, making it nearly impossible to launch. I pulled out my phone and took photos, then called the sheriff's office. Deputy Morrison came out and took a report. Looks like someone dumped this here deliberately, he said. Probably overnight. You have any enemies? Just one. He followed my gaze toward Margaret's house, visible through the trees. I'll look into it. 2 days later, it happened again. More debris, including some concrete chunks that had clearly been placed there intentionally. This time, I set up a trail camera facing the water. The camera caught her. At 2:30 in the morning on December 7th, Margaret Pemberton drove her Mercedes down to the public access point a quarter-mile north of my property, launched a small boat, and motored over to my ramp. She spent 20 minutes dumping construction debris into the water around my dock, then left. The video was crystal clear, thanks to the camera's night vision. I had her license plate, her face, and a clear view of her actions. I called Deputy Morrison and showed him the footage. He watched it twice, shaking his head. That's criminal mischief, trespassing, and possibly environmental violations for dumping in the lake. I'll need to take this to the prosecutor. Do it, I said. The sheriff's office arrested Margaret on December 10th. She was charged with criminal mischief, criminal trespass, and illegal dumping. The local newspaper picked up the story, Former HOA, President arrested for sabotaging neighbor's property. It made the front page. Margaret's attorney tried to get the charges dismissed, arguing that there was no proof the debris had caused any real damage. The prosecutor countered with the video evidence and testimony from the Idaho Department of Lands about the environmental impact of dumping construction materials in a lake. The judge wasn't sympathetic. The case went to trial in March. I testified about the ongoing harassment, the illegal fence, the destroyed boat ramp, and finally the sabotage. Other Pine Vista residents testified about Margaret's pattern of vindictive behavior. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding her guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Margaret to 120 days in jail, 3 years probation, a $10,000 fine, and restitution for the cost of cleaning up the debris from the lake, which came to another $8,000. He also ordered her to have no contact with me for 5 years. As they led her out of the courtroom, Margaret turned to look at me. For a moment, I expected her to shout something, to make one last threat, but instead, she just looked defeated, exhausted. She'd spent so much energy trying to control everyone around her, trying to punish me for daring to stand up to her authority, and it had cost her everything. I didn't feel triumphant, just tired. The Pine Vista HOA, under Linda's leadership, became a model of reasonable governance. They focused on actual community improvements, repaving roads, maintaining common areas, organizing neighborhood events. The shared boat ramp stayed in perfect condition, and I used it regularly, though I also kept my private ramp functional as a backup. My property values actually increased. Turns out, having your own private boat ramp is a selling point, though I had no intention of selling. I'd put down roots in Hayden. I joined a local fishing club, volunteered with a youth outdoor education program, and became friends with several of the Pine Vista residents who'd stood up to Margaret. Tom became a regular fishing buddy. Robert and I played poker every Thursday night with a group of retirees. Linda invited me to HOA meetings as a guest sometimes, just to provide input on issues that might affect my property. Life settled into a peaceful rhythm. I spent my mornings on the lake, my afternoons working on property improvements, my evenings reading on the porch or socializing with friends. It was exactly the retirement I'd imagined when I left Seattle. One afternoon in late July, about 8 months after Margaret's conviction, I was working in my garden when a car pulled up. A young woman got out, maybe 30 years old, with Margaret's blonde hair and sharp features. "Mr. Xavier? I'm Amanda Pemberton, Margaret's daughter." I set down my trowel and stood up, wary. "What can I do for you?" I wanted to apologize for my mother. She looked genuinely uncomfortable. "I know what she did to you was wrong. I've been trying to get her to see a therapist for years. She has some serious control issues, and they've only gotten worse since my father died." I softened a bit. "I'm sorry about your father." "Thank you. He was the one who kept her balanced, I think. After he passed, she just spiraled. The HOA presidency gave her a sense of power, and she became obsessed with it." Amanda shook her head. "I'm not making excuses. What she did to you was criminal. But I wanted you to know that not everyone in our family is like that." "I appreciate you coming here," I said. That took courage. "She's getting help now. In jail, they required counseling. She's been diagnosed with some things. I don't know if she'll ever really change, but at least she's getting treatment." Amanda hesitated. "I also wanted to tell you that I think what you did standing up to her, not backing down, probably saved lives in the long run. If she'd kept going the way she was going, sooner or later she would have hurt someone worse than dumping debris in a lake." I thought about that. Maybe she was right. Margaret had been escalating, getting more desperate and irrational with each attempt to maintain control. "I hope she gets better," I said, and meant it. Amanda smiled sadly. "Me too. Thank you for hearing me out." After she left, I sat on my porch for a long time, looking out at the lake. The afternoon sun made the water sparkle like diamonds. A family was swimming off a dock a few hundred yards away, their laughter carrying across the water. A boat cruised past, leaving a gentle wake. I thought about the whole insane journey from that first confrontation at the boat ramp to Margaret's arrest, from considering just giving up and moving away to deciding to fight for my rights, from the satisfaction of building my own ramp to the exhaustion of endless legal battles. It had been worth it, not because I'd won exactly, though I had, but because I'd stood up for myself when someone tried to bully me into submission. I'd used the legal system the way it was supposed to work to protect property rights and hold people accountable for breaking the law. I'd made allies in my community and improved my property at the same time. The following week, the Pine Vista HOA held their annual summer barbecue. This year, they'd expanded it to include non-HOA neighbors, which meant I was invited. I brought my famous smoked ribs, a recipe I'd perfected over decades, and spent the afternoon eating, drinking beer, and swapping stories with my neighbors. Linda gave a speech thanking everyone for their patience during the difficult transition period, which got a laugh from everyone who knew what that was code for. She announced that the HOA had a budget surplus for the first time in 5 years and that they were planning to use it to build a community playground and renovate the clubhouse. Robert pulled me aside at one point. "You know, Franklin, you joining this neighborhood was the best thing that ever happened to us. You forced us to confront problems we'd been ignoring for years." "I just wanted to use my boat ramp," I said with a grin. "Well, you've got 2 of them now. That's pretty good." It really was. As fall arrived, I established a new routine. I'd wake up early, make coffee, and walk down to the lake to watch the sunrise. The morning mist rising off the water was beautiful, peaceful in a way that made all the stress and conflict feel distant and unimportant. I took my boat out several times a week, exploring different parts of Lake Coeur d'Alene. I discovered hidden coves, quiet fishing spots, and scenic islands. Sometimes I went alone. Sometimes Tom or Robert or other friends joined me. Once I took a group of kids from the youth outdoor program on a fishing trip, teaching them how to read the water and where the bass liked to hide. The shared boat ramp continued to work perfectly. The HOA maintained it according to schedule, and I never had another moment of trouble accessing it. My private ramp stayed ready as a backup, and occasionally I used it just to enjoy the satisfaction of having built it myself. Winter came, and with it, ice fishing season. I'd never tried ice fishing before moving to Idaho, but Tom introduced me to it, and I got hooked. We'd drill holes in the frozen lake, set up a portable shelter, and spend hours sitting in the cold catching perch and trout. It was meditative in its own weird way. Margaret was released from jail in April after serving her full sentence. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd sold her house and moved to Spokane to live with Amanda. She never contacted me, which was fine. I hoped she was getting the help she needed, but I didn't need closure or confrontation. That chapter was closed. The Pine Vista HOA continued to thrive. They implemented new bylaws that included term limits for board members, transparent budgeting, and a formal appeals process for fines and violations. Linda served 2 years as president, then stepped down voluntarily, and a guy named Marcus took over. The community became known as one of the better-run HOAs in the county. My property became a bit of a local legend. People driving by would sometimes slow down to look at the private boat ramp, and I got occasional offers from real estate agents asking if I'd ever consider selling. I always said no. I'd found my home. 2 years after everything settled, I was invited to speak at a county planning commission meeting about property rights and HOA governance. Apparently, my case had become a teaching example in local real estate law circles. I talked about the importance of understanding your deed restrictions, standing up for legal rights, and using the system to resolve disputes rather than escalating to personal conflict. A reporter from the Coeur d'Alene Press interviewed me afterward. The article ran with the headline, "Retired Engineers' Property Rights Battle Leads to HOA Reform." It was fair and accurate, and I appreciated that they focused on the bigger picture rather than just the drama. Life continued peacefully. I dated a woman named Patricia for a while, a retired teacher who loved hiking and shared my appreciation for quiet mornings and good coffee. That didn't work out long term, but we stayed friends. I traveled a bit, visiting my kids in California and Oregon, taking a fishing trip to Alaska, spending a month touring national parks. But I always came back to Hayden, to my lakefront property, to my 2 boat ramps and my peaceful routine. I'd built something there. Not just physical structures, but a life that felt authentic and earned. On the 5th anniversary of buying the property, I threw a party. I invited everyone who'd supported me through the whole ordeal: David Chen, who'd provided excellent legal advice; Rick Johansson, who'd built my boat ramp; Linda, Robert, and the other Pine Vista residents who'd stood up to Margaret; Tom and my other friends from the fishing club; even Deputy Morrison, who'd taken my complaints seriously and followed through. We grilled steaks, drank local beer from Coeur d'Alene Brewing, and told stories late into the evening. Someone asked me if I regretted buying the property, given all the conflict it had caused. I looked around at the friends gathered on my patio, at the lake shimmering in the sunset, at the boat ramp I had built with my own design and determination. "Not for a second," I said. The legal bills had been expensive. The construction costs had been significant. The stress had been real. But I'd stood my ground, protected my rights, and helped improve a community in the process. I'd turned a retirement that could have been defined by conflict with a petty tyrant into something meaningful and satisfying. As the party wound down and the last guests left, I walked down to my private boat ramp and sat on the dock, my feet dangling over the water. The lake was calm, reflecting stars starting to emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere across the water, a loon called, its eerie cry echoing across the surface. I thought about everything that had happened, all the twists and turns from that first confrontation with Margaret to this quiet moment of contentment. The journey had taught me things about myself, that I could fight when necessary, that I could be strategic and patient, that I could turn obstacles into opportunities. Building the second boat ramp had been about more than just accessing the lake. It had been a declaration of independence, a refusal to be controlled by someone else's unreasonable demands. And closing the road through my property had been leverage, yes, but it had also been justice, showing Margaret and the HOA that actions have consequences, that you can't treat people badly without eventually paying a price. The system had worked. The law had protected my rights, the community had corrected its own problems, and I'd ended up with a better property and better relationships than I'd started with. I stood up, stretched, and walked back up to my house. Tomorrow I'd take the boat out early, try that new fishing spot Tom had told me about. Maybe I'd invite some of the neighborhood kids to come along, teach them how to tie proper knots and read a fish finder. For now, though, I was content to sit on my porch, sip a bourbon, and enjoy the peace I'd fought so hard to secure. The lights of Pine Vista Estates twinkled through the trees, friendly now rather than hostile. The road through my property carried occasional traffic as residents came and went, using the easement I'd granted in good faith after the HOA had finally learned to act in good faith themselves. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I'd just given up that first day when Margaret blocked my access. If I'd decided the fight wasn't worth it and either sold the property or just accepted being unable to use my boat. I'd have avoided all the conflict, all the legal bills, all the stress. But I also would have taught Margaret that her bullying worked. I would have let the Pine Vista residents continue suffering under her tyrannical rule. I would have given up rights that were legally mine, setting a precedent that might have harmed future property owners. And I would have missed out on the deep satisfaction of knowing I'd built something lasting, not just a boat ramp, but a principle. The principle that you don't have to accept being pushed around, that legal rights matter, that communities can govern themselves fairly if people are willing to stand up and demand it. The bourbon was smooth, aged 12 years in Kentucky oak barrels. I savored it slowly, enjoying the warmth and the subtle flavors. A cool breeze came off the lake, carrying the scent of pine and water. My boat was tied securely to my private dock, ready for tomorrow's adventure. My property was peaceful, beautiful, mine. I'd won more than a legal battle. I'd won the right to live the life I'd planned, in the place I'd chosen, on my own terms. And that, in the end, was worth every penny, every hour of stress, every moment of conflict. The stars came out fully, brilliant against the dark Idaho sky. I finished my bourbon, locked up the house, and went to bed. Tomorrow would be another good day on the lake, another day of the peaceful retirement I'd earned. And if anyone ever tried to block my boat ramp again, well, I had 2 of them now, plus a really good attorney on speed dial and a community that had my back. But I didn't think that would be necessary. Some battles only need to be fought once if you fight them right, and I had definitely fought this one right.